Master Sergeant Ryan Caldwell grabbed the rifle out of her hands before she even reached for it. "Put that down," he said loud enough for every soldier on the range to hear. "You're here to sweep the floor, sweetheart, not touch equipment that costs more than your entire life savings." The laughter that followed hit like a wave, and Elena Cross, the woman who collected empty casings for a living, stood completely still, holding a broom while 30 trained soldiers laughed at her like she was nothing. But she was not nothing. She never was. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Part 1, the woman nobody noticed. The Silver Hawk training range sat 40 miles outside of Tucson, in the kind of Arizona desert that didn't forgive mistakes. The sun came up hard and fast out there. By 7 in the morning, the ground was already baking. By 9, the heat rose in visible waves off the sand, turning the distant ridgeline into something that shimmered and bent like a mirage. The wind moved in strange directions, shifting without warning, carrying dust and the smell of gunpowder across an expanse of open land that stretched nearly as far as the eye could see. It was a brutal place to work. And for Elena Cross, it had been home for 3 years. Not home in any comfortable sense. There were no warm lights waiting for her at the end of the day, no fireplace, no family dinner. Home for Elena meant familiarity. It meant knowing every corner of the range the way a farmer knows every acre of his land. It meant waking up before the soldiers arrived, walking the firing lines in the gray pre-dawn quiet, and picking up the scattered brass casings that littered the ground after the previous day's training. She was 38 years old, and she had been doing this job since the facility hired her as a civilian support specialist following her grandfather's death. That was the official title, Civilian Support Specialist. What it actually meant was janitor, equipment, handler, maintenance crew, and silent observer. She cleaned the range. She repaired broken target mechanisms. She sorted ammunition cases, cataloged equipment, and filed reports that nobody ever actually read. She worked 6 days a week, arrived before sunrise, and left after the last soldier walked off the firing line. She wore the same faded tan uniform every day, and she kept her dark hair pulled back in a braid so tight it gave her a headache by afternoon. And in 3 years, she had learned something interesting about the way people saw her. They didn't. Not really. She was background noise. She was the woman with the bucket and the broom. She was the person you walk past without making eye contact, the way you might step around a piece of furniture you'd stopped noticing years ago. The soldiers at Silverhawk were not cruel people for the most part. They were disciplined, serious, dedicated men and women who took their training with a gravity that Elena genuinely respected. But they existed in a world with a very clear hierarchy, and somewhere far below every ranking soldier, beyond the civilian instructors, past the administrative staff, there was Elena Cross, invisible, unremarkable, easy to overlook. She had made peace with that a long time ago, or so she told herself on most mornings. The truth was more complicated, and it lived in a place she didn't visit often. It lived in the memory of her grandfather's voice, patient and precise, talking her through the angle of a shot at 400 meters while she was 11 years old and lying flat on the dry Arizona ground, breathing slow, feeling the wind on the back of her neck like a second conscience. His name was Harold Cross. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a military marksman before coming home to a ranch outside Flagstaff, where the desert stretched in every direction. And silence was not something you endured, it was something you used. Harold Cross did not teach his granddaughter to shoot the way most people imagine such a thing happened. He did not hand her a rifle and say, "Here, pull the trigger." He taught her to read, not books, not manuals. He taught her to read the world around her. "Watch the grass before you look at the target," he told her when she was 9. "The grass will tell you what the wind is doing before you feel it on your face. The temperature changes the way a bullet travels," he said when she was 12. "A hot day is not the same as a cool morning. The same shot, same rifle, same distance, 2 completely different problems to solve. Patience is not a virtue in this discipline," he told her. At 14, when she was finally shooting at distances that made most adult shooters nervous. Patience is a skill, and like every skill, it has to be practiced until it becomes automatic. She had practiced for years on that quiet ranch with nothing but open desert and a grandfather who believed she was capable of extraordinary things. Elena had practiced. She learned how humidity changed bullet drop. She learned how elevation affected air pressure, how air pressure affected trajectory, how trajectory was not a single line but a complex curve that responded to dozens of variables simultaneously. She learned to feel the moment a wind gust was about to shift, not because someone told her, but because she had spent so many hours in the desert that her body had absorbed the patterns, the way a sailor absorbs the rhythm of the sea. By the time she was 17, Elena Cross could make shots that grown men with military training struggled to replicate. By the time she was 20, she had turned down two separate opportunities to pursue competitive shooting because the idea of performing for an audience made her feel hollow in a way she couldn't explain. She shot because it was honest, because in the act of making a precise long-range shot, there was no room for politics or personality or rank. There was only the physics. There was only the truth of the problem in front of you, and either you solved it or you didn't. That was the one thing Harold Cross had given her that she couldn't find anywhere else. Now where performance was real. When Harold died, the ranch was sold. Elena was 35 and had spent the intervening years doing what quiet people with no appetite for competition tended to do, working useful jobs in the background of other people's important work. She did not regret it, most days. She had applied for the position at Silverhawk because it was practical. It was steady work, it was outdoors, and it kept her connected to a world that still felt like the most honest one she knew. The world of rifles and ranges and long flat distances. Even if she was only watching, even if nobody knew what she was watching for. The morning that changed, everything started like every other morning at Silverhawk. Elena arrived at 5:52, 12 minutes before her official start time, because she always did. She unlocked the equipment, a shed pulled out, the rolling cart, loaded it with collection bags and tools, and began her first pass of the primary firing line. The range was quiet. She liked it quiet. The sound of her boots on packed earth, the light clinking of brass casings dropping into the metal bucket, the distant call of a bird somewhere in the desert scrub. These were the sounds that belonged to her, the ones that came before the soldiers arrived and turned the range into something loud and purposeful. She moved methodically down the line, Bay 1 through 12, clearing and logging. The sky was turning from gray to pale gold when she heard the first vehicle. Then a second, then a third. She glanced up to see three military vehicles rolling toward the upper range, the long-distance section, the part of Silverhawk where serious work happened. The kind of training that didn't involve paper silhouettes at 50 meters. The kind where a missed calculation didn't just mean a missed shot. It meant a failure of understanding, and at this facility, failures of understanding were treated with the gravity they deserved. Elena went back to her work. The soldiers climbed out of the vehicles, and she heard their voices, low at first, then louder, as the morning energy built. Equipment cases being opened. The metallic sound of rifles being handled. The particular confident rhythm of men who were very good at something they were about to demonstrate to men who were trying to become good at the same thing. She recognized the voice before she heard the words. Master Sergeant Ryan Caldwell. She had heard his name more times than she could count. I was something of a legend at Silverhawk, and he knew it. That was both true and problematic in Elena's assessment, though she kept that assessment entirely to herself. Caldwell was a decorated sniper. His record at the range was legitimate. She had heard the numbers discussed too many times to doubt them, and she was not a person who dismissed genuine achievement because she didn't like the person behind it. He had earned what he had earned. What he had not earned was the way he walked through the facility as though the space around him belonged to him. The way he spoke to junior soldiers with a condescension that wore the costume of instruction. The way he made everything about himself, every lesson, every demonstration, every moment on the range, until you were never quite sure whether he was teaching or performing. She had been watching him for 3 years. He had never once looked directly at her. Listen up! His voice carried across the range with the practiced volume of someone who had given the same speech many times. Elena did not look up from her work. She moved to Base 7 and began collecting. Today we're going to talk about what long-range precision actually means, Caldwell was saying. Not the textbook version, not what they teach you in fundamentals. I'm talking about real-world application at distances that will make most of you realize you've got a long way to go. Murmurs of agreement from the gathered soldiers. I've been shooting at this range for 11 years, Caldwell continued. I've hit targets that most qualified snipers said were impossible. I hold 3 facility records, and 2 of those records have stood for over 4 years. So when I tell you something about long-range marksmanship, I'm not giving you theory, I'm giving you experience. Elena moved to Bay 8. She was aware without looking that the group was positioned perhaps 40 meters from her current location, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough that she was, as usual, completely outside anyone's field of attention. The thing most shooters never understand, Caldwell said, is that this discipline selects for a specific kind of mind. It's not just training, it's not just physical ability. It's a particular way of thinking that you either develop or you don't. And some people, no matter how hard they try, they don't have it. And that's fine. That's why there are other roles. She moved to Bay 9. She heard one of the younger soldiers, a voice she didn't recognize, ask something about maximum effective range. Caldwell laughed. It was a comfortable laugh, the laugh of a man who found the question both expected and slightly beneath him. Maximum effective range, he repeated, as though tasting the phrase. That's a military definition. That's a number they put in a manual so nobody gets embarrassed. In reality, the ceiling is much higher. The ceiling is determined by the shooter's ability, the equipment available, and the conditions on a given day. I've shot at distances that aren't in any manual. What's the longest you've made? Another voice asked. Confirmed hit. Caldwell let the pause do its work. 3,200 meters. 3.2 kilometers across open desert, accounting for a 12-knot crosswind and a 15-degree temperature differential from when I'd last zeroed the rifle. Genuine sounds of admiration from the group. Elena moved to Bay 10. She was counting the casings as she worked. Her hands moved automatically. The count was nearly automatic, too. Could you do it again? The first young voice asked. Right now, Caldwell said. In these conditions, probably not 3,002. But I could put a round on target at 2,500, no problem, with the right setup. She moved to Bay 11. That was when she made her mistake. Not a dramatic mistake. Nothing anyone would have noticed or remembered under different circumstances. She simply paused for a moment longer than usual at Bay 11 because the casings there were mixed calibers, a sorting issue that would take an extra few seconds to address. And in that pause, she happened to be facing in the direction of the group, facing them without looking at them. But Caldwell saw her pause, and something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was the stillness. Most people in constant motion, the way workers on a range tend to be, don't stop and stand still unless something holds their attention. And Elena in that moment had gone still. Hey, his voice had a different quality now. Lighter, the quality that meant he was switching modes from instruction to entertainment. She looked up. Every soldier turned to follow Caldwell's gaze. 30 pairs of eyes landed on Elena Cross for what was for most of them the first time. Caldwell was smiling. It was a broad, easy smile, the kind that was designed to look friendly while performing something else entirely. You, he said, pointing at her. Come over here a second. She'd considered not going. She had learned that in situations like this, and she had navigated enough of them to recognize the shape before it fully formed. The wisest response was usually to keep your head down. Keep moving and let the moment pass. People like Caldwell needed an audience, and an audience needed a subject. If the subject didn't engage, the performance had nowhere to go. But 30 soldiers were already watching, and something in the way Caldwell pointed at her. Not a wave, not a polite gesture, but a point the kind you use to indicate an object, rather than a person, made a very quiet decision form in Elena's chest. She walked over. She kept her posture easy and her expression neutral. She carried the collection bucket at her side. She stopped a few feet from the edge of the group, not close enough to suggest she was joining them, not far enough to suggest she was intimidated. What can I do for you, Sergeant? She said. Caldwell, he said. Master Sergeant Caldwell, you're the range maintenance crew, right? Civilian support specialist, she said. Right. He nodded as though this confirmed something. So you work out here every day? Every day, she said. You watch us train. I work while training happens, she said. Occasionally I observe. Occasionally you observe. He repeated it back with a slight smile, turning to share that smile with the soldiers around him. Several of them smiled back. So you've seen some shooting. I've seen a great deal of shooting, she said. You ever try it yourself? He asked it casually, the way you might ask someone if they'd ever tried a restaurant you liked. Elena kept her expression neutral. Occasionally. Caldwell's smile widened. Occasionally, what's the most powerful rifle you've ever actually fired? She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was calculating how to answer. She knew exactly how to answer. She was quiet because she was giving herself one final moment to decide whether to be honest or to protect herself the way she usually protected herself, which was by giving people less than they were asking for. "I've fired most configurations of long-range precision rifle," she said. "Bolt action, semi-auto, suppressed and unsuppressed. The most powerful by caliber would be a .50 BMG Barrett." Something shifted in the group. A few soldiers glanced at each other. Not the smirking glances of people who thought she was lying, something more uncertain than that. But Caldwell recovered immediately. "A Barrett." He nodded as though indulging a child. "Did someone let you hold it at a gun show or—" "My grandfather owned one," she said. "I shot it at distance regularly for approximately 4 years." The smile didn't disappear from Caldwell's face, but its quality changed in a way that Elena had learned to recognize over years of watching people like him. It became slightly fixed, slightly mechanical, the smile of someone recalibrating. "Your grandfather," he said. "Harold Cross," she said. "He was a military marksman. Vietnam, he spent 30 years after his service training on a private range outside Flagstaff." "And he taught you to shoot," Caldwell said. "He taught me everything he knew," she said. "Yes." There was a beat of silence. One of the younger soldiers, she caught him out of the corner of her eye, had stopped smiling. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not contempt, something more like careful attention. Then Caldwell did what she had been watching him angle toward since the moment he called her over. He turned to the assembled soldiers, opened his hands in a gesture of theatrical generosity and said, "Well then, since you know so much about it, and since you've apparently been watching us train all these years, let me ask you something." He pointed, not at her, past her, toward the distant ridge at the far end of the upper range. "You see that target?" She turned and looked. Even at this distance, she could make out the steel plate, a standard silhouette, set against the base of the far ridge. Small, very small. "I see it," she said. "That's 4,000 meters, Caldwell said. She heard someone in the group draw in a slow breath. 4,000 meters was not a standard training distance. 4,000 meters was a number that lived at the very outer edge of what was theoretically achievable with the equipment available at this facility, and most experienced snipers would spend significant time on preparation before attempting it under even ideal conditions. "I know what it is," she said. "Do you?" Caldwell's smile had found its final form now, broad, comfortable, entirely self-satisfied. "Because I'll make you an offer. If you can hit that target one shot, no adjustments, I will personally stand in front of every soldier at this facility and tell them you belong up here with the best of us." He paused. "But if you can't, and you won't, then you go back to collecting brass and let the professionals work." The group was very quiet. Elena looked at the distant ridge for a long moment. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the desert mornings when the world was still and the air was honest, and the only thing that mattered was the truth of what you understood versus what you didn't. She thought about 30 years of standing in the background, and she said, "What rifle?" The silence that followed was the kind that takes up physical space. Caldwell blinked. It was a small thing, barely a moment, but Elena saw it and she filed it away in the same quiet interior drawer where she kept everything she observed. He had expected hesitation. He had expected a nervous laugh or a quick refusal, or maybe the option he'd probably been counting on for her to walk away with her head down so the performance could end with a comfortable punchline. He had not expected the question, "What rifle?" "What rifle?" he repeated. "I need to know the configuration," Elena said. "Caliber, barrel length, scope, magnification, whether it's been zeroed today and at what distance, and how old the current ammunition lot is." Another silence, longer this time. One of the soldiers, a younger man near the back of the group, maybe 23, with a specialist rank on his collar, had gone completely still. His eyes were moving between Elena and Caldwell, with an expression of someone watching a situation that was no longer developing the way he'd expected. Caldwell turned slowly to his equipment table and picked up a rifle. It was a serious piece of equipment, a precision long-range bolt action chambered in .308 Lapua Magnum with a high magnification scope and a suppressor that told Elena immediately this was a setup intended for genuine extreme range work, not demonstration shooting. He held it out to her. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it first. "When was it last zeroed?" she asked. Caldwell's jaw tightened just slightly. "This morning," he said. 800 meters. Is this the same ammunition lot that was used for the Zero? Yes, said a different voice. Not Caldwell's, the specialist near the back. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone who had just realized he was in the presence of something he didn't fully understand yet. Elena looked at the young specialist. What's the dope at 1,000 meters? She asked. He didn't hesitate. 11.4 mils elevation, he said, at this temperature and pressure. You have a data card. He pulled it from his vest pocket and held it out. She took it. She read it. She handed it back. Caldwell watched all of this happen without speaking. His expression had settled into something carefully neutral, the face of a man who had been performing confidence for so long that he wasn't entirely sure what lived underneath it. Elena took the rifle. She held it the way someone holds a tool they know well, not reverently, not tentatively, but with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who has performed this action several thousand times and stopped thinking about it consciously long ago. She checked the chamber. She verified the scope settings. She ran her thumb along the bolt and felt the action. I need a stable position, she said. Not a bench, a natural position, ground level. Caldwell stared at her. Ground level at 4,000 meters, you're going to shoot from the ground. The bench introduces vibration at extreme distance, she said, already moving toward the edge of the firing line. And I want the lowest possible profile to reduce wind effect on the shooter's position. She heard him say something behind her, but the words were blurred by the sound of boots on gravel because the soldiers were moving, all of them. Not on instruction, not on command, spontaneously. They were following her to watch. Elena settled onto the ground at the edge of the firing line. The earth was warm under her. The sun was fully up now, and the desert in front of her was alive with the heat distortion that made extreme range shooting one of the most demanding disciplines in existence. She set the rifle in the natural position her grandfather had taught her, not the aggressive pose she saw in training manuals. A nearly relaxed configuration because tension in the body transferred to the rifle and tension at the moment of firing meant deviation at the point of impact. She looked through the scope. The distant target materialized small clear in the magnification shimmering slightly at the edges due to heat mirage. 4,000 meters, Zha began calculating. Not with a device, not with a ballistic calculator, with the part of her mind that had been trained since childhood to treat this problem the way a musician treats a complex piece, not as a collection of technical steps, but as a whole pattern that could be felt as much as calculated. Wind at the shooter's position, mild variable from the west-northwest. Wind at mid-range, she watched the range flags. Different. The flags at 500 meters and 1,500 meters were doing different things. Layered wind, a complex variable that broke most shooters who weren't trained to account for it. Wind at the target, the hardest to read. She watched the scrub grass on the far ridge for 30 seconds. She watched the dust on the ground at range's end. She felt the pattern forming in her mind, the way shapes form in clouds, not sharp and definitive, but probable. Suggested. She adjusted the scope. Caldwell stood 6 feet behind her, watching through a spotting scope. She heard him mutter something to a soldier beside him. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was still performing confidence. Still performing the certainty that this would end in embarrassment. She breathed. She found her position in the shot, not the position of the body, but the position of attention. The place she had learned to inhabit where everything unnecessary fell away and only the problem remained. Her grandfather's voice, so many years gone now, was still perfectly clear. The bullet only follows the truth of physics. You cannot argue with it. You cannot charm it. You can only understand it or fail to understand it. She watched the flags. She watched the grass on the ridge. She waited. 1 minute passed. 2. She heard Caldwell shift his weight behind her. Heard someone in the group clear their throat. Heard the distant sound of something moving in the desert scrub far off to her left. She waited, because patience was not a virtue. It was a skill. And then in the space between one breath and the next, the wind pattern simplified. The layered variable collapsed briefly into something readable, not perfect, never perfect, but close enough. A window maybe 3 seconds wide where the factors aligned in a way that made the problem solvable. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle moved. The sound was enormous and then was gone, swallowed by the open desert. The bullet traveled. At extreme range, there is always a wait. The bullet does not arrive instantly. At 4,000 meters, traveling at a velocity that drops as it covers distance, there are several seconds of pure suspension, a kind of terrible patience during which nothing has been decided yet and everything has been decided already. Elena did not move. She stayed behind the scope. She watched the target. She waited. 1 second, 2, 3, 4. The sound arrived before anyone had processed what they were waiting for. A sharp metallic crack, distant faint, traveling across 4 kilometers of open desert with all the subtle delay of something that happened a long time ago. But it was unmistakable. Steel hit steel. She had heard that sound more times than she could count on those long mornings with Harold on the ranch. The sound a bullet made when it found the target you sent it toward. Elena lifted her face from the scope. She did not turn around immediately. She took one breath. Then she stood, and she turned, and she looked at Caldwell. His spotting scope was still at his eye. His entire body was different. The easy stance was gone. The theatrical posture was gone. He was standing in a way that looked for the first time in Elena's 3 years of watching him like a man who had been surprised. Not by what just happened, by what he was looking at. The impact mark on the target at 4,000 meters. He lowered the spotting scope slowly. He did not speak for several seconds. The soldiers around him were looking at each other. Quiet, specific looks. The kind exchanged between people who have just witnessed something that has shifted their understanding of what's possible. The young specialist, the one who'd given her the data card, was looking at Elena, not with the uncertain expression from before, with something close to awe. Finally, Caldwell said, "Hit." The word was so quiet it was almost private, but everyone heard it. "Direct hit," he said, and his voice was steady in the way that voices become steady when a person is working very hard to control what they're actually feeling. The target was struck. The desert was completely silent for one more full second. And then the soldiers erupted. Not one or two of them, all of them, voices and movement and the particular unreserved sound of military men, responding to something they genuinely didn't see coming. Someone said something that Elena couldn't make out. Someone else laughed, not the earlier laughter, not the comfortable laughter of people watching a joke unfold, but the sharp, astonished laughter of men who had just had a basic assumption removed. Elena stood in the middle of it, holding the rifle at her side, and felt the sun on her face and thought about her grandfather. She thought about 30 years of early mornings on open ground. She thought about the patience that wasn't a virtue. She thought about physics, which didn't care about rank or reputation or who held the rifle. She thought about all the years she had stood in the background of this world watching. And she thought, this is not about what just happened. This is not about him. This is about the fact that the shot was always inside me. It was just waiting for the moment when someone finally made the mistake of asking. She handed the rifle back. She picked up her collection bucket, and she walked back to Bay 11 to finish sorting the casings. She walked back to Bay 11 and the bucket hit the ground with a soft metallic sound, and Elena Cross crouched down and began sorting casings like nothing had happened. Her hands moved automatically. Brass to the left, steel to the right, mixed calibers in the center tray for secondary sorting. But her hands were trembling, not from fear, not from nerves, from the particular kind of physical release that happens when the body has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and finally lets go. Her fingers sorted the casings with muscle memory while the rest of her simply breathed, simply existed in the ordinary quiet of the job she had been doing for 3 years and let the trembling pass. She could hear them behind her, not their words, their energy, the sound of 30 men processing something together that none of them had individually expected. The particular group dynamic of military personnel encountering a disruption to their model of the world, not loud, not dramatic, but pervasive, a kind of collective recalibration that expressed itself in short sentences and quiet questions, and the particular silence that fell between those questions. She did not turn around. She sorted casings. She had learned a long time ago that the moments immediately following something significant were the most dangerous moments to let your guard down. People who had just been surprised were unpredictable in ways that were sometimes generous and sometimes not. She had learned to wait until the surprise settled into something more defined before she allowed herself any reaction. Her grandfather had a word for it. He called it the echo. Every shot had an echo, and the echo lasted longer than the sound. She sorted casings and waited for the echo to finish. It took about 4 minutes. Then she heard footsteps behind her, and they were deliberate, and she knew without turning who they belonged to. She kept sorting. The footsteps stopped 2 feet behind her. Miss Cross. Caldwell's voice was different, not dramatically different. He hadn't transformed into a different person. Elena had no illusions about how quickly or completely people changed. But the theatrical quality was gone. The performance was gone. What was left was something more stripped down and because of that, more honest. She stood and turned. I was standing without the spotting scope in his hand for the first time since she'd walked over. His hands were at his sides. His posture was that of a man who had recently put something down and hadn't yet figured out what to do with himself. Sergeant, she said. I was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be working through a sequence of things he might say, discarding them one by one. Where did you learn that? He finally asked. Not how did you do that? Not what kind of training do you have? Those were the questions of a man who was trying to categorize the experience, to file it in a drawer labeled known quantity and move on. The question he actually asked was more personal than that. Where did you learn that? My grandfather's ranch, she said, outside Flagstaff. He nodded slowly like he was hearing her for the first time, which in the way that actually mattered he was. Harold Cross, he said, not a question. He'd remembered the name. Harold Cross, she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment. The desert morning moved around them, a distant vehicle, the wind in the scrub, the ordinary sounds of a facility coming fully awake. And Caldwell stood in the middle of it, looking like a man who was doing an accounting he hadn't anticipated and was not enjoying the result. How many shots like that have you made? He asked. Like what? Extreme range, 4,000 and above. She thought about it genuinely, the way you think about a number you've never had reason to count before. I don't know, she said honestly. Many. My grandfather used to set targets at extreme range every Saturday morning. We called them Sunday problems because they were too complex to rush. She paused. We did it for years. Caldwell absorbed this. Behind him, the group of soldiers was watching, pretending not to, the way people pretend not to watch something that has their complete attention, but watching. You should have said something, Caldwell said, about your background. Elena looked at him steadily. When would have been the appropriate moment for that conversation, Sergeant? I didn't answer, because there wasn't one, and they both knew it. In 3 years of passing her in the facility, of watching her collect casings and repair targets and maintain equipment, that his record depended on functioning correctly in 3 years of existing in the same physical space. Ryan Caldwell had never once asked Elena Cross a question about who she was. That was the moment it landed on him. She watched it happen. It was not a large or dramatic thing. It was quiet, the way realizations sometimes are when they're serious. A slight change around the eyes, a readjustment of the jaw. The body language of a man confronting an honest fact. He nodded once. Fair, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked back toward the group, and Elena turned and walked back to her bucket. And the morning at Silverhawk training range continued. But something in its fabric had changed permanently, and everyone present could feel it, even if none of them had the language for it yet. The young specialist found her 20 minutes later at the far end of the line. She was working through Bay 15, the last bay before the upper range barrier, and she heard his footsteps before she heard his voice, lighter than Caldwell's, quicker, the footsteps of someone who was uncertain whether he was allowed to be doing this. Miss Cross. She looked up. He was young, 23, she'd estimated maybe 24. His specialist rank was new enough that the insignia still looked slightly stiff on his collar. He had the specific face of someone who had grown up taking everything seriously, because everything had always felt high stakes, and this gave him a kind of focused intensity that most young soldiers either had naturally or never developed. His name tape said Reyes. Specialist, she said. He stopped a few feet away. I'm Marcus Reyes. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt your work. You're not interrupting it, she said. You're delaying it. What do you need? He actually smiled at that briefly in spite of himself. I wanted to ask you about the wind calculation, he said. At 4,000 meters with the layered wind pattern we had this morning, I ran the numbers in my head while you were setting up and I couldn't get them to converge. The mid-range wind was doing something completely different from the flags at the line, and I couldn't figure out how to account for both without choosing one and accepting the error on the other. Elena set down the bucket. You were trying to average them, she said. He blinked. Yes. I was trying to find a weighted average based on the estimated time the bullet would spend in each wind zone. That's the textbook approach, she said. It works to about 2,200 meters under most conditions. Past that, the calculation isn't an average anymore. It's a pattern recognition problem. Rhea stared at her. Pattern recognition. The wind at range isn't a static variable, Elena said. It moves, it has timing. At extreme distance, by the time the bullet reaches the mid-range wind zone, that zone's conditions may have shifted from what you observed at the start. So you can't calculate the condition as it exists at the moment you fire. You have to calculate the condition as it will exist during the time the bullet is in that zone. Reyes was quiet for a moment, then, that's predictive modeling. My grandfather called it reading ahead, Elena said. The same way a good chess player isn't looking at the current position. They were looking at the position 3 moves from now. How do you get good at that? She picked up the bucket. Years, she said, and paying attention to things that most people stop noticing because they don't seem important. He watched her start walking, then he walked with her. She noticed that he didn't ask permission. He just walked beside her, and there was something about the naturalness of it that she respected without analyzing. How long have you been here? He asked. 3 years, she said, and nobody knew. He said it without accusation, but the shape of the question was pointed. Nobody asked, she said. I was quiet for a while after that. They reached Bay 16 and she began working, and Reyes stood nearby in the way that people stand when they're processing something and need to be near another person while they do it. Caldwell's good, Reyes said finally. I mean genuinely. His record here is real. I know it is, Elena said. But he treats people like they're props in his story, Reyes said. The words came out carefully, like he'd been holding them for a while and was testing how they sounded outside his head. The junior soldiers especially, he uses us to make himself look better. Elena didn't respond to that directly. She sorted casings. Then she said, most people who are genuinely good at something still spend a significant portion of their energy managing how other people perceive that thing. It's a kind of insecurity that's built directly into high achievement. The more real the skill, the more afraid you are that someone won't see it the way you know it is. Reyes thought about that. So he's afraid. Everyone who performs confidence the way he does is afraid of something, Elena said. It doesn't make his record less real. It doesn't make what he did this morning acceptable. Both of those things are true at the same time. Reyes nodded slowly. Then his radio crackled and a voice came through, sharp, institutional, and he straightened. I have to go, he said. Go, she said. I went 3 steps. Then he turned back. Can I ask you something else sometime? She looked at him. About the wind calculation. About all of it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Bay 11, she said. I start there at 6 every morning. He nodded, then he was gone. She watched him walk back toward the upper range, and she thought about her grandfather, and she thought about what it meant to know something for a long time and carry it alone. Then she went back to Bay 16 and finished her work. The facility's internal report system worked on a 24-hour cycle, which meant that news of unusual events at the range typically reached command staff the following morning in the form of a training log that someone, usually a senior NCO, submitted at the end of each session. That was the standard timeline. Caldwell's radio call to the facility commander broke with that timeline by approximately 23 hours and 40 minutes. Elena didn't know he'd made the call until the following morning when she arrived at the equipment shed at 5:52 and found a note taped to the door. It was on official facility letterhead. It said, report to Commander Whitfield's office at 0800. She read it twice. She went inside and began loading her cart. At 0800, she knocked on the door of the facility commander's office with the particular quiet knock of someone who has spent a lifetime not taking up more space than necessary. Come in, said a voice. Commander Patricia Whitfield was 61 years old, had 32 years of military service behind her, and had been running Silverhawk for 6 of them. She was a small woman, smaller than most people expected from her voice, which carried absolute authority without ever quite raising itself. She had steel gray hair, cut practically short, and eyes that assessed with the efficiency of a tool built specifically for that purpose. Elena had seen her on the range twice in 3 years. She had never spoken to her. Specialist Cross, Whitfield said, and then immediately corrected herself. Ms. Cross, sit down. Elena sat in the chair across the desk. She folded her hands in her lap and kept her posture easy and her expression neutral, the way she had learned to sit in rooms where she did not control what was about to happen. Whitfield looked at a document on her desk. She looked at it for a moment in the manner of someone who already knows what it says and is using the reading time to decide how to begin. I received a report from Master Sergeant Caldwell last night, she said. I expected you might, Elena said. Whitfield looked up. Something briefly crossed her face, not surprise, but the recognition that she'd underestimated the pace of this conversation. He says you made a confirmed hit at 4,000 meters this morning, Whitfield said. That's correct, Elena said, using facility equipment during a standard training exercise. During a demonstration that Caldwell was running for junior personnel, Elena said. He issued the challenge directly. I accepted it. Whitfield set the document down. She looked at Elena with the full attention of someone who had been running a training facility for 6 years and understood in a way that was almost physical the significance of what she was hearing. Walk me through the shot, she said. Elena walked her through it. Not the performance version, not the story version that would make her sound remarkable. The technical version, wind assessment, ammunition selection, position, choice, and the reasoning behind it. Scope adjustments, the predictive calculation on layered wind patterns, the timing, the decision to fire. Whitfield listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, the commander was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, why didn't we know about any of this? It was the same question Caldwell had asked, but it carried different weight from Whitfield. From Caldwell, it had been rhetorical, the question of a man realizing he had been operating with incomplete information. From Whitfield, it was something more direct than that. It was accountability asking to be located. I wasn't hired to shoot, Elena said. I was hired to maintain the range. That doesn't answer my question, Whitfield said. Elena considered. No one asked, she said, and I didn't volunteer it because the job I was doing needed to be done, and I was doing it. I didn't see the need for more explanation than that. Whitfield studied her. And now, the situation changed, Elena said simply. Another silence. Then Whitfield said, I'm going to be direct with you. What Caldwell did this morning, publicly issuing that challenge in front of junior personnel, with the intent to humiliate a civilian employee, is something I will be addressing with him separately and formally. That's not the conversation we're having right now. Elena nodded. The conversation we're having right now, Whitfield continued, is about what this facility does with the information that we apparently have a precision shooter of significant capability working on our maintenance crew. The room was very quiet. What are you suggesting? Elena asked. I'm asking, Whitfield said carefully, what you want. The question was so simple and so unexpected that Elena felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not emotion exactly, more like the physical sensation of space opening up where something compressed had been living for years. She looked at the commander. She thought about her grandfather, about the ranch, about 30 years of mornings in the desert shooting at impossible distances with no audience, no record, no recognition. She thought about the moment she had chosen quiet work over visible achievement, and she thought about whether that choice had been wisdom or cowardice, and she honestly wasn't sure. I don't know yet, she said. Whitfield seemed to respect that answer more than a confident one would have warranted. She nodded once slowly. You have some time to think about it, she said. But I want you to know that the opportunity exists, formally, in whatever configuration makes sense. She paused. I should also tell you that 3 of the soldiers who were present this morning have already submitted unofficial commendations for the shot. One of them is Caldwell himself. Elena was quiet for a moment. That surprised you, Whitfield said. A little, Elena admitted. It surprised me too, Whitfield said. And for the first time, something in her expression moved towards something warmer. He submitted it within 2 hours of the event. Said, and I'm quoting the document here, that he witnessed a demonstration of technical skill and disciplinary patience that exceeded anything he had personally produced in 11 years on this range. Elena looked at the window. She didn't have anything to say to that. He also said, Whitfield continued, and again I'm quoting, he owed the civilian support specialist a direct apology and intended to deliver it personally. But he wanted the record to reflect the achievement first. Elena thought about Caldwell standing at the edge of the group, spotting scope at his eye, watching the steel plate at 4,000 meters. She thought about the way his voice had gone quiet when he confirmed the hit. She thought about the word he'd said fair when she'd told him there had never been a moment for that conversation. She thought about the fact that it is possible to genuinely dislike the way a person behaves and still respect the moment when they decide to behave differently. That was generous of him, she said. It was honest of him, Whitfield said. There's a difference. She left Whitfield's office at 8:47, having been gone from the range for 47 minutes, which was the longest continuous absence from her work she could remember in 3 years. The sun was fully up. The range was active. She could hear distant shots from the qualification line and the particular rhythm of drilled instruction from somewhere near the upper bays. She went back to the equipment shed. She thought about what Whitfield had asked her. What do you want? She had spent so many years making peace with not being asked that she had almost lost the vocabulary for answering. She picked up her bucket. She walked to Bay 11, and she started working. She was at Bay 13 when Caldwell found her for the second time that day. He walked differently than he had that morning. Not smaller. Caldwell was not a man who got smaller when he was uncomfortable, but more deliberate. The performance was still gone, and what replaced it was the careful movement of someone choosing every step intentionally. He stopped when he was close enough to be heard without raising his voice. "Ms. Cross," he said. "Sergeant," she said. I was quiet for a moment. She kept working because she had learned that giving people silence was often the most useful thing you could offer them when they were trying to say something important. "I owe you an apology," he said. She set down the bucket and turned to face him. I was looking at her directly. Not performing looking at her, actually looking at her the way people look at each other when they've decided to dispense with the layers of role and reputation that usually stand between two people in a facility like this. "What I did this morning," he said, "was wrong. Not because of the outcome. The outcome is beside the point. It was wrong because I used you as material for a performance. I used the way I assumed you were to entertain people. That's not something I can dress up into something better than it was, and I'm not going to try." Elena listened. "You didn't deserve that," he said, "and the fact that you're extraordinary at what you clearly do doesn't excuse what I did. If you'd missed that shot, if you'd shot and missed and walked away, the way most people would have, my behavior would still have been the same. The apology is for the behavior, not for the outcome." Elena looked at him for a moment. The desert was moving around them. The range was active. Somewhere behind him, a rifle fired and the echo moved across the flat ground. "I appreciate the distinction," she said. "Most people wouldn't have made it." He absorbed that. "I've been thinking since this morning," he said, "about how many times I've walked past you in 3 years. "Many times," she said. "And never once," he stopped, started again. "I run these sessions for junior soldiers, and the entire premise is that I know what exceptional looks like, that I can identify it. That's the basis of everything I do here." He paused. "And you were 20 feet away the whole time." 17 feet most mornings," she said. "Bay 9 is closest to the upper range observation point." He stared at her. Then something happened that she genuinely hadn't predicted. Ryan Caldwell laughed. Not the performative laugh she'd heard from him during training sessions, the practice sound that was really a social tool. This was an actual laugh, short, real, slightly pained, the kind that happens when a person is confronted with the full absurdity of their own blind spots. 17 feet, he said. "Approximately," she said. He shook his head slowly. The laugh faded but left something behind, a loosening around the eyes, a marginal but genuine reduction in the tension he had been carrying all morning. "Are you going to accept the commander's offer?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. "You know about that. I suggested it to her last night when I submitted the report," he said. "I told her the facility would be wasting a significant asset if it didn't at least make the conversation available to you." Elena was quiet. That surprised her, and she decided he deserved to know it. "That also was generous," she said. "Honest," he said, and he said it the way Whitfield had, like he'd heard the word recently and was trying it on for fit. She picked up the bucket again. "I haven't decided yet," she said, "about the offer." "Fair enough," he said. She began walking toward Bay 14. She was almost there when he called after her. "Ms. Cross." She stopped but didn't turn. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not a lot coming from me right now, your grandfather sounds like he was an extraordinary teacher." She stood still for a moment. The sun was hot. The range was loud with the ordinary sounds of training. Somewhere far off at the end of the upper range, a steel plate that she had hit at 4,000 meters was sitting in the desert morning, registering no particular significance about what had passed. But she was. "I was," she said. And she walked to Bay 14, and she kept working, and the day moved on around her, and the Silverhawk training range was exactly what it had always been, a place where some people proved what they were made of, and others watched it happen, except that by 3 in the afternoon, everyone on the line knew her name. Not the woman with the bucket, not the range maintenance crew, Elena Cross. And that changed everything about what the next morning was going to look like, whether she had decided anything or not. By 6 the next morning, Bay 11 already had a visitor. Elena heard the footsteps before she saw him. She was still 20 feet from the bay cart, loaded bucket in hand, moving through the pre-dawn quiet, the way she always did, methodically without hurry, the way a person moves when they have made peace with the pace of their own work. And then she looked up, and Marcus Reyes was standing at Bay 11 with a notebook in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, wearing his uniform with the particular uprightness of a young soldier who had arrived somewhere early and was trying not to look like he'd been waiting. I had been waiting. You're here, he said, and immediately looked like he wished he'd said something smarter. Bay 11, she said. 6 o'clock, that's what I told you. Right. He held out the thermos. I brought coffee. I didn't know how you take it, so it's black and I can get something else if… Black is fine, she said. She took the thermos. She poured a small amount into the thermos cap, which functioned reasonably well as a cup if you held it steady. She drank it standing there in the pre-dawn gray, and Reyes watched her with the expression of someone who had shown up with 100 questions and was now recalibrating which one to ask first. You didn't sleep much, she said. It wasn't a question. How can you tell? The notebook, she said. People who sleep well don't fill notebooks overnight. He looked down at it. The edges of the pages were soft from handling. He'd written a great deal and written it at speed, the kind of speed that happens when your mind is moving faster than your hand and you're trying to catch everything before it escapes. I kept thinking about the layered wind problem, he said, the predictive modeling. I tried to build a framework for it, like a mental structure I could actually apply in the field without a calculator, and I kept hitting the same wall. The variables compound too fast. Every time I thought I had a workable approach, it collapsed at the third or fourth variable interaction. Elena set the thermos cap down on the cart. She began working, Bay 11 as always. But she spoke while she worked because she had learned from her grandfather that the best teaching happened in motion. Show me the wall, she said. He opened the notebook. He had drawn diagrams, actual hand-drawn trajectory curves with variable annotations. The kind of thing you did when you were working a problem seriously and didn't have anything else to work it with. They were rough, but they were correct in their approach. He had been thinking about the right problem. He just hadn't found the right frame. Here, he said, pointing at a section of notes, I can calculate wind drift at one zone. I could calculate it at two zones if I run them sequentially. But the bullet's velocity changes across those zones, which means the amount of time it spends in each zone changes, which means my drift calculation for zone 2 is wrong before I've even finished calculating zone 1 because I've assumed a velocity that's already changed. Right, Elena said. So how do you solve it? You don't, she said. He stared at her. You don't solve it. Not the way you're trying to solve it, she said. You're treating it like an algebra problem. Find the values, plug them in, get an answer. But that model only works when the variables are static. Moving variables in a dynamic system don't have solutions. They have approximations. Okay, he said slowly. So how do you find the approximation? You stop trying to calculate the position of each variable, Elena said, and you start trying to feel the direction they're moving in. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Feel it, he said. He said it the way people say things when they're not sure whether they're being tested. My grandfather used to say that a mathematician and a shooter are trying to solve the same problem 2 different ways, Elena said. The mathematician wants the exact answer. The shooter needs the useful answer. At 4,000 meters, the exact answer doesn't exist. The conditions change between the moment you calculate them and the moment the bullet arrives. So you stop hunting the exact answer and you start hunting the direction. The direction, Reyes repeated. Is the wind accelerating or decelerating? Is the temperature rising or dropping? Is the mirage compressing or expanding? You don't need to know the precise value of each variable. You need to know which way each one is traveling and how fast. She dropped a handful of casings into the bucket. Then you make a decision that accounts for where they'll be rather than where they are. He wrote that down, quickly without looking at the paper, still watching her. That's what you did yesterday morning, he said. That's what I did. You were watching the range for almost 3 minutes before you fired, he said. I timed it. She glanced at him. You were timing me. I time everything, he said without apology. It's a habit, but I didn't understand what you were doing in those 3 minutes. Everyone around me thought you were stalling. Caldwell thought you'd realized you were in over your head and were trying to figure out how to back out gracefully. He paused. But that wasn't it. No, she said. You were reading the direction, he said. I was reading the direction, she confirmed. The wind pattern at this range has a cycle. It's approximately 90 seconds between directional shifts on a morning like yesterday. High pressure, moderate temperature, differential wind coming off the mountains to the northwest. I needed to see 2 full cycles before I understood the pattern well enough to predict the third. Rhea stared at her. 3 minutes, he said. You watched for 3 minutes because you needed to see the pattern twice before you could predict it the third time. Close enough, she said. He closed the notebook slowly. Something had changed in his face, not dramatically, but genuinely. The focused intensity that was his natural expression had gone a level deeper towards something that looked almost reverent, not toward Elena specifically, toward the thing she was describing, toward the size of what he had glimpsed without fully seeing. How long did it take you to develop that? He asked. Years, she said. Many years. Could someone else learn it? She looked at him. Is that the question you really want to ask? He met her gaze directly. Could I learn it? She held the look for a moment, measuring something she did not have a specific word for the particular quality of attention in a person that told you whether they had the patience to be taught the hardest things. Come back tomorrow morning, and she said, Bay 11, 6 o'clock. He nodded once sharp and certain the nod of someone who had just received something important and intended to treat it that way. His radio crackled. He straightened automatically. I have to report in, he said. Go to, she said. I went. She watched him walk back toward the range notebook under his arm, and she thought about all the mornings her grandfather had said, come back tomorrow, and how those 2 words repeated over years had eventually built something that no single lesson could have built. Then she picked up her bucket and moved to Bay 12. The formal apology happened at 10:17 that morning, not privately. Elena had not expected it to be private. She had observed enough of Caldwell to know that he did nothing at half measure, which was both his greatest strength and the source of most of his problems. He either performed fully or he didn't perform at all, and when he had decided the previous evening to do this particular thing, he had apparently also decided to do it the way he did everything, in front of people. She was at the equipment shed performing a scheduled maintenance check on 3 rifles that had been flagged the previous week for scope calibration issues when she heard voices approaching. More than one. Several. She set down the rifle in her hands and turned. Caldwell was walking across the compound with 6 soldiers behind him, including Reyes, including 2 men she recognized as senior enlisted from another training unit who had not been present during yesterday's exercise, including a young female corporal she'd seen on the qualification range twice in the past month. They stopped in front of the shed. Caldwell looked at her. I know you're working, he said. I'll be brief. All right, she said. He straightened, not parody ground straight. He wasn't performing military formality. He stood the way a person stands when they want to be taken seriously and are trying to let the content do the work rather than the posture. Yesterday morning I behaved badly, he said. I used a position of authority to make a colleague a subject of public ridicule. I did it with the intention of using her assumed weakness to demonstrate my own skill, and I did it in front of junior personnel who are supposed to learn in part from the way I conduct myself. He paused. The fact that the result was the opposite of what I intended doesn't change what I intended. So what I intended is what I'm accounting for. The compound was quiet. Even at Silverhawk, where people were trained to hold still, this had the quality of a held breath. Miss Cross, he said, I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 30 soldiers who had laughed with him the previous morning. She thought about the bucket in her hand and the 20 meters between her and the group and the very specific quality of the laughter. Comfortable, collaborative. The laughter of people who had all agreed on something without having to say what it was. She thought about her grandfather who had told her once that an apology was not a resolution. An apology was a beginning. A resolution was what you built after. I hear you, she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not disappointment. He hadn't been expecting an instant absolution, and she'd known that about him from the moment he said he would be brief. But something like relief, the specific relief of someone who has delivered a thing they've been carrying and is not yet sure whether they've been received. I appreciate it, he said. He nodded once. He turned. The group behind him began dispersing. Reyes was the last to go. He looked at Elena for a moment before he left, and in that look was a whole conversation that neither of them needed to speak aloud. The look of someone who had been present for both mornings, who had watched the full arc of it, and who understood more fully than most of the others what had just happened and what it would cost both of the people involved to continue from here. High left. Elena picked up the rifle she had set down. She went back to the scope calibration. The morning moved on. At 12:45, Commander Whitfield's assistant appeared at the equipment shed door with a single printed document and the information that the commander would appreciate Miss Cross's signature at her earliest convenience. Elena read the document. It was a formal skills assessment authorization. In the language of official military documentation, it was careful and specific. It authorized the facility to evaluate Elena Cross's technical capabilities in long-range precision shooting under controlled conditions with a view toward potential reclassification of her role within the facility's civilian contractor structure. In plain language, it was the first step towards something that 3 days ago had not existed as a possibility in Elena's life. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical, not what made sense, not what was safe, what she actually wanted. She thought about the morning before Harold died when she had driven out to the ranch from Tucson and found him at the range at 5 in the morning, the way she always found him prone behind the rifle, perfectly still, waiting for the wind to tell him something. He had been 74 years old and his hands had not been entirely steady for 2 years. But behind the rifle, he was as still as he had always been, because stillness was not a physical thing. It was a mental one. She had sat beside him and watched him shoot. And afterward, when he was packing up the equipment, he had looked at her with the eyes of someone who was saying something larger than the words he was using. And he said, "You know what this is for. Don't spend your life cleaning up after people who don't." She had thought about that every day since. She signed the document. She handed it back to the assistant. She went back to work. The rest of that week at Silverhawk moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. On the surface, it moved at the ordinary pace of a training facility, the rhythm of sessions and debriefs and equipment checks in the particular physical language of people who spent their days handling serious tools in service of serious purposes. Underneath that surface, something was moving much faster. The story spread the way stories spread in enclosed institutional environments, not through official channels, not through announcements, but through the organic, unstoppable communication of people who have witnessed something and cannot stop talking about it. Elena heard fragments of it in the way she heard everything, not because she was eavesdropping, but because she moved invisibly through spaces where people said things they would not have said if they'd been aware of an audience. She heard one soldier tell another that the maintenance woman had made a shot that Caldwell himself called impossible and had done it on her first attempt with a rifle she had never touched before that morning. That last part wasn't accurate. She had inspected the rifle before shooting, which was not the same as never touching it, but she understood that accuracy was not the primary function of the story as it was being told. She heard a senior sergeant say that Caldwell had voluntarily submitted a commendation for a civilian contractor, which was the kind of thing that had exactly never happened in the facility's history. She heard a corporal say that the civilian woman who worked Bay 11 had been trained by a Vietnam-era military marksman and could read wind patterns the way most people read road signs. That one was close enough to accurate that she almost smiled. What she had not expected was the woman who appeared at Bay 11 at noon on Thursday. Not a soldier, not facility staff. She was wearing civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a blue shirt, in the specific look of someone who existed in a professional context that was adjacent to the military but not inside it. She had a camera around her neck, which was a very specific kind of professional camera, and she carried herself with the energy of someone who worked in information. Her name was Diana Peralta. She said so immediately with the practiced directness of a person accustomed to introducing themselves quickly to people who hadn't been expecting them. "I'm a feature writer," she said. "Defense and Veterans Affairs. I work primarily with 2 publications, one of which you'd recognize." She said the name of the publication. Elena recognized it. "I received information from a source within this facility about what happened Monday morning. I verified the basics with public-facing facility records before coming. I'd like to speak with you if you're willing." Elena kept working. "How did you get on the range?" she asked. "I have a press credential for military training facilities," Peralta said. "It covers observation access. I'm not here in an official capacity for the facility, just for the story." "What story?" Elena said. Peralta looked at her steadily. "Your story," she said. Elena set down the bucket. She looked at Peralta with the full assessment she usually reserved for variables in a complex calculation, taking in the whole of what she was seeing and deciding what it meant. I'm not a story, Elena said. That's exactly what people say when they are one, Peralta said, and there was something in her directness that Elena respected despite herself. What information do you have? Elena asked. Enough to write something, Peralta said. Whether it's accurate, incomplete, or partial and speculative depends on whether you talk to me. Elena picked up the bucket again. Walk with me, she said. Peralta walked with her. Elena moved through Bay 13, Bay 14, working as she talked because she was not going to let an unexpected journalist disrupt her schedule. But she was also, and this was the thing she admitted to herself quietly while her hands moved through the casings, not uninterested in being heard by someone who was asking in this particular way. What would the story say? Elena asked. The truth if you tell me the truth, Peralta said. A woman with exceptional skills spent 3 years in an invisible role at a military training facility. An incident of public humiliation became unexpectedly the moment those skills were revealed. The questions the story asks are about the systems that made that possible, how exceptional ability goes unrecognized, what those costs are, whether anything changes. She paused. And something about the woman herself, her background, what she carries with her. Elena was quiet for a moment. My grandfather, she said. If you want to talk about him, Peralta said. Elena thought about Harold, about the ranch, about all those mornings that existed nowhere except in her memory and in the accuracy of what she carried because of them. He deserves to be part of it, she said quietly. Then tell me about him, Peralta said. She did. Not everything. Not the way you tell everything to someone who has been trusted over years. But the essential shape a man who had served, who had come home to the desert, who had taken his skills and spent them not on reputation but on transmission, who had taught a girl to read wind and air and distance, who had told her that the bullet only follows the truth of physics and that you either understand it or you don't, and that understanding it was the entire work. Peralta listened. She asked questions that were specific and careful and showed she was paying attention. She did not write while Elena talked. She had a small recorder, which she asked permission to use, and Elena said yes, and the recorder sat between them on the cart while Elena's hands worked and her voice moved through the story of Harold Cross and the ranch outside Flagstaff and everything she had learned there. When Elena finished, Peralta turned off the recorder. One more thing, and she said, what do you want people to take away from this? Elena thought about that for a long time. Bay 15, Bay 16, the end of the line. I don't think that's the right question, she finally said. Peralta looked at her. The right question is what my grandfather wanted, Elena said. He spent his life trying to teach one thing. That skill is real, not reputation skill, not performance, actual ability. And actual ability doesn't care about any of the things we use to decide who gets to have it. She paused. He taught a girl on a desert ranch to shoot at targets 4,000 meters away, not because she was special, but because she paid attention, and because he gave her the time to pay attention. She was quiet for a moment. I think he wanted people to know that time costs something, and what you spend it on is the only biography that matters. Peralta was quiet for several seconds. Can I quote that, she said. That's what I said it for, Elena said. She arrived at the equipment shed to end her day at 5:43, 17 minutes before her scheduled finish, and found Reyes sitting on the steps with his notebook and the second thermos of coffee in 2 days. You're early, she said. Early is on time, he said. That's a military thing. I know what it is, she said. She sat on the steps beside him. He poured coffee without being asked. She took it. They sat in the quiet of the late afternoon and the range was winding down around them, the particular decompression of a facility, going from active to resting, the last voices fading, the equipment being secured. I heard about the journalist, he said. News travels fast here, she said. Everything travels fast here, he said. It's a small facility with a lot of people who pay close attention to everything. He paused. Are you okay with it, the story? She thought about it genuinely. I'm okay with what I said, she said. I don't control what she does with it. Is that enough? It has to be, she said. He nodded. They drank coffee. Then he said, can I show you something? He opened the notebook to a page near the middle. He had drawn a diagram more refined than the one she'd seen that morning, cleaner, the product of a full day's further thought. It was a model for the layered wind calculation. Not a precise mathematical model. He had moved past trying to make it one. It was something more like a decision tree, a branching structure that used directional questions rather than precise values. Is the near zone wind accelerating? Is the far zone wind from the same source or a different pressure system? Is the temperature gradient increasing or decreasing? At the end of each branch was not a number, but an instruction for posture. Adjust for a head of current position. Hold at current calculation. Accept the drift and time the shot for minimum impact. Elena looked at it for a long time. She did not say anything immediately. Reyes watched her face. It's rough, he said. I know it's rough. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's where I got to today and I wanted to. It's not rough, she said. He stopped. It's incomplete, she said. You're missing a variable class on the far side. You need to account for what happens when the two pressure systems are moving toward each other rather than in parallel. That changes the timing calculations significantly. She paused. But the framework is right. The instinct is right. You stopped trying to calculate the position and you started trying to predict the movement. He stared at the notebook. Something happened in his face that Elena had seen before in the mirror, in the years when she was young and her grandfather had told her something that landed at exactly the right angle and lit up a connection she hadn't been able to make on her own. The recognition that something difficult had just become possible. Come back tomorrow, she said. Bay 11, he said, 6 o'clock. Bring the notebook, she said. She stood and picked up her things. She was 3 steps away when she stopped because she had thought of something, and she had learned from her grandfather that the things you thought of in the last moment before leaving were often the things that mattered most. She turned back. Reyes, she said. I looked up. That diagram, she said. My grandfather would have approved of it. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. She left. And the following morning, when she arrived at Bay 11 at 5:52, the cart loaded and the bucket in hand, she was not surprised to find him there already. I had arrived even earlier than the first time, and the notebook was open in his hands. And this time the page he was looking at had 3 more variables. She had not mentioned additions he had worked out in the night, and every one of them was correct. She looked at the page. She looked at him. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face changed, and she said, add the pressure convergence model on the next page, and we'll go through it before the range opens. He turned to the next page. He had already started it. The article came out on a Friday. Elena didn't know it had published until Reyes showed up at Bay 11 that morning at 5:48, 12 minutes earlier than usual. And the expression on his face was not the focused, notebook-ready look she had come to expect in the 2 weeks since their early morning sessions had begun. It was something different, tighter. The look of someone who has learned something and is not entirely sure how the person they're about to tell will receive it. I had his phone in his hand. It's up, he said. She looked at the phone. The article was open on the screen in the full-length feature, the kind that took up a significant portion of a publication's digital real estate. The photograph at the top was one Peralta had taken herself here on the range, and Elena had not known she was being photographed at the time. It showed her in profile at the far end of the firing line bucket, at her side, face turned toward the distant ridge, with an expression that she could not read objectively because it was her own. She looked like she was thinking about something far away, which she probably had been. She read the title. She handed the phone back. Is it accurate? Reyes asked. From what I can see in 30 seconds, she said yes. It's getting shared, he said. A lot. It went up at midnight, and by 6 this morning, he looked at the screen. It's significant. How significant? He told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her bucket and started working. Bay 11, she said. Pressure convergence model. You were going to show me the revision from yesterday. Reyes stared at her for a half second, the half second of a person recalibrating around someone who has just processed a significant piece of information and moved through it faster than expected, and then he opened the notebook. Right, he said. Okay, so the revision. He walked beside her while she worked, and he talked through the revision, and for the next 40 minutes, the article existed somewhere at the edge of both their minds without either of them mentioning it again. Because the pressure convergence model was genuinely complex, and it deserved the attention, and because Elena had made a decision in the space between reading the title and picking up the bucket about what she was going to allow to become the center of her morning. The article was not going to be the center of her morning. The work was. It was 9:23 when Commander Whitfield's assistant appeared for the second time in Elena's working day. This time there was no printed document. The commander would like to see you, the assistant said. When you have a moment. Elena set down the rifle calibration tool she was holding. I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said. She cleaned her hands. She walked to Whitfield's office. She knocked with the same quiet knock as before and heard the same voice say, "Come in." Whitfield was standing this time rather than sitting, which was the first thing Elena noticed. She was standing at the window with a coffee cup in her hand, looking out at the range with the particular posture of someone who has been processing something for a while and has recently arrived at a conclusion. She turned when Elena entered. "You saw the article," Whitfield said. "This morning," Elena confirmed. "My phone has been active since 6 a.m., Whitfield said. "I've received calls from 3 separate publications, 2 television production companies, a veterans advocacy organization, and the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office." She set the coffee cup down. In that order. Elena was still. "The Pentagon," she said. "Their public affairs people monitor coverage that involves military training facilities," Whitfield said. The article name-checked Silverhawk 12 times. "So," she looked at Elena directly, "how are you?" The question was asked with genuine intent, and Elena felt the weight of it land differently than official questions usually landed. "I'm working through it," she said honestly. Whitfield nodded. "That's the right answer." She moved to her desk and sat, which seemed to be a deliberate choice, a signal that this conversation was going to be real, rather than procedural. The skills assessment was scheduled to begin next month. Given the visibility the article has created, I want to offer you the option of accelerating it, beginning as early as next week, or holding to the original schedule or withdrawing entirely if this has become something you don't want. "Why would I withdraw?" Elena asked. "Because attention changes things," Whitfield said. "Some people discover they wanted recognition in theory, but the reality of it is more complicated than they expected. I've seen it happen. There's no shame in it." She paused. "And some people decide that what they had, the quiet work, the private skill, was actually exactly what they wanted, and the disruption of visibility costs more than it returns." Elena thought about Harold. She thought about a man who had spent 30 years shooting at targets on a private range outside Flagstaff, with no audience, no record, no recognition, and who had been in those 30 years more at peace with his own ability than most celebrated professionals ever managed to be. She thought about whether that was wisdom. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about the fact that she was the only person alive who carried the full weight of what he had known, and that if she walked away from this moment, that knowledge walked away too. "Accelerate it," Elena said. Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. "Next Monday," she said. "Full assessment. But I'll have the evaluation team here by 0700. "I'll be at Bay 11 at 6, Elena said. Something crossed Whitfield's face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Of course you will," she said. The evaluation team arrived on Monday at 6:58. There were 4 of them. 3 military evaluators and 1 civilian contractor who specialized in precision shooting assessment. They carried more equipment than Elena had seen assembled in one place outside a major training exercise, and they set it up with the efficiency of people who did this regularly and had no patience for anything that wasn't essential. Elena arrived at Bay 11 at 6 o'clock, as she had told Whitfield she would. She had been there for 58 minutes before the evaluation team arrived, and in those 58 minutes she had worked through Bays 11, 12, and 13 with her usual methodical pace, and she had drunk half a thermos of coffee, and she had spent approximately 20 of those minutes standing at the end of the firing line, looking at the far ridge. Not thinking about the evaluation, thinking about the wind. It was doing something interesting this morning. The night had been unusually warm, which was creating an inverted temperature gradient, near the ground warmer, air below, cooler above. And the effect on the mirage rising from the desert floor was producing a compression pattern she hadn't seen at this range in several months. It would affect shots above 2,000 meters in a specific way that was not accounted for in the standard range data cards. She filed this information in the part of her mind that held things which would be needed later, and then she went and met the evaluation team. The lead evaluator's name was Colonel James Archer. He was 54, built like someone who had once been significantly larger and had spent years becoming precise about what he kept and what he discarded. He had the demeanor of a person who had run a great many assessments and was not particularly susceptible to either narrative or reputation. He would evaluate what he saw. Elena respected that immediately. He introduced himself and his team. He explained the structure of the assessment. It would take place across 2 days, covering technical knowledge equipment, handling position and hold fundamentals, and lobbying biker at progressive distances from 500 to 4,000 meters. 4,000 meters, Elena said. Is that a problem? Archer asked. No, she said. I wanted to confirm it was intentional. It's intentional, he said. He looked at her with the look of someone who had read a file and is deciding how much of what he's read to credit. The shot you made on the 1st of this month has been reviewed by 2 independent ballistic analysts using the range's video documentation and the weather data from that morning. Elena had not known the shot was on video. She kept her expression neutral. Their assessment, Archer continued, is that the shot as executed represents a level of wind compensation and trajectory calculation that is not consistent with recreational or informal training alone. The methodology they identified in the pre-shot process, the observation period, the specific scope adjustments made the firing position chosen indicates a training foundation that is significantly more advanced than what has been documented in your file. He paused, which currently contains nothing about shooting ability. I was hired to maintain the range, she said. I understand that, he said. I'm noting that there appears to be a significant discrepancy between your documented role and your actual capability. And I want you to know we're here to resolve that discrepancy in the accurate direction. He said it without judgment, without drama. Simply, we are here to see what is true. She found that she liked him considerably. All right, she said. What do you need me to do first? The first day of the assessment was technical. Archer's team put Elena through 6 hours of written and verbal examination on ballistic principles, environmental variable assessment equipment, configuration and maintenance and failure analysis. They gave her scenarios, complex, multivariable problems presented in rapid succession and assessed not just whether she arrived at the correct answer, but how she arrived at it, the reasoning process, the hierarchy of variables she prioritized, the speed at which she moved from problem identification to solution. Elena answered the questions the way she did everything steadily, without performance, with the underlying sense that the only thing that mattered was accuracy. By mid-afternoon, the civilian contractor, a woman named Sandra Cole, who had the specific watchfulness of someone who rarely found anything that surprised her, had stopped writing on her evaluation form and was simply listening. That was the first thing Elena noticed. At 3:42, Cole leaned over to Archer and said something quietly. Elena didn't hear the words. She saw Archer's expression, not surprised, but confirmed. The face of someone whose hypothesis has been supported. I looked at Elena. I'm going to ask you something that isn't on the standard assessment, he said. All right, she said. The inverted temperature gradient this morning, he said. Did you account for it in your range walk? The room they were in, a facility conference room by this point, went slightly quieter. Elena looked at him. I observed the compression pattern in the morning mirage during my 6 o'clock walkthrough, she said. It indicated an inversion layer approximately 8 to 12 meters off the ground, which would create a lateral drift correction of approximately 0.3 mils at distances above 2,000 meters, with the drift direction dependent on the specific shot azimuth. She paused. I was going to factor it into tomorrow's live fire calculations. Archer was quiet for a moment. Cole set her pen down entirely. You identified that at 6 this morning, Archer said, before the assessment began. It was the most interesting variable of the day, Elena said. It seemed worth noting. Another silence. Then Archer said, Ms. Cross, in 22 years of running precision shooting assessments, I have asked that question to approximately 40 candidates. He looked at her steadily. You are the third person who has answered it correctly. The first 2 were both active duty senior snipers with over a decade of field experience. The room held that information. Elena didn't respond to it immediately. Then she said, What were the other 37 doing when you asked? Making excuses, Cole said, and her voice carried the dry precision of someone who had heard a great many excuses and had stopped being softened by them some time ago. That night, Elena sat in her apartment, a small, sparse place 6 miles from the facility that contained everything she needed and nothing she didn't, and she thought about the assessment. Not the results, because she did not know the results and had learned from her grandfather that evaluating your own performance before all the evidence was in was a reliable way to be wrong in either direction. She thought about the inverted temperature gradient question. She thought about Archer's face when she answered it. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not the abstract version of being seen, the inspirational version. The one that existed in stories about hidden talent and deserved recognition. The real version. The version that meant your skill belonged to more people than just you now. The version that meant the quiet mornings with the bucket and the brass casings and the absolute privacy of your own competence were over. Because the thing you had carried alone for 3 years was now known, and once something was known, it could not be unknown. She sat with that for a long time. She was not afraid of it exactly, but she was honest about what it cost. Her phone rang at 9:41. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway because she had developed the habit over years of not letting uncertainty make her avoidant. Ms. Cross, a voice she didn't know, male measured with the cadence of someone who communicated professionally for a living. My name is Robert Lane. I'm a senior producer with a National Defense and Veterans Affairs documentary program. We've been following the coverage of your story, and I'm calling to ask if you would be willing to have a conversation about a possible feature. Elena was quiet for a moment. How did you get this number, she asked. The facility's public affairs office provided contact information for media inquiries, Lane said. She made a note to speak to Whitfield about that. I'm in the middle of an assessment, she said. I'm not available for media conversations until it concludes. I completely understand, Lane said. I'm simply asking whether after the assessment you'd be willing to... After the assessment, she said, I'll know more about what I'm willing to discuss. Call this number again in a week. She hung up. She sat for another hour. Then she went to bed because the second day of the assessment began at 7 and she needed to be at Bay 11 by 6. The live fire day began in a stillness that felt intentional. The evaluation team had cleared the range. No other training was scheduled. The facility had been quieted in the specific way that high-stakes events, quiet environments, not through instruction, but through the gravitational pull of something important, pulling all the attention in the same direction. Elena stood at the firing line at 7 o'clock in the position she had chosen, ground level, natural configuration with Archer's team positioned behind her and Archer himself at the spotting scope. Reyes was not supposed to be there. I was there anyway, standing at the outer edge of the cleared range with 3 other soldiers who had also found reasons to be in that approximate area at that approximate time. She saw them when she arrived and she did not acknowledge them because acknowledging them would have made them official, and official presences were the kind of thing that created procedural problems. But she knew they were there, and she was glad. The first distance was 500 meters. She hit the target in one shot, and the team recorded the result with the efficiency of people who had expected nothing less and were moving quickly through the lower distances to get to the ones that mattered. 750 meters, one shot, one hit. 1,000 meters, one shot, one hit. Archer said nothing at each distance. He recorded and moved. 1,500 meters, one shot, one hit. 2,000 meters. This was where most precision shooters began to show their individual signatures, the specific adjustments and habits and tendencies that revealed how they had been trained or how they had trained themselves. At 2,000 meters, the environmental variables had enough distance to develop their character, and the shooter's relationship with those variables became visible. Elena spent 45 seconds in observation before she fired. One shot, one hit. She heard Cole say something quietly to another team member. She couldn't make out the words. 2,500 meters. The inversion layer she had identified yesterday morning was present and active. The compression pattern in the mirage had developed through the morning in the direction she had predicted, which meant the lateral drift correction she'd calculated the previous day was accurate. She adjusted the scope by the amount she had calculated at 6 o'clock yesterday morning. She waited for the timing window. She fired. 3 seconds of suspension. The metallic sound of impact arriving across 2,500 meters. Archer's voice even and professional hit. 3,000 meters. This was where it stopped being a demonstration and became something closer to the outer edge of what was reliably achievable. At 3,000 meters in these conditions, with this equipment, a significant percentage of experienced snipers would accept a first-round miss as a reasonable outcome and plan for a correction shot. Elena did not plan for a correction shot. She lay in position for 90 seconds before she fired. The temperature had shifted 4 degrees since the morning's first observation, and the wind at mid-range had rotated 11 degrees clockwise in the past 40 minutes. And she accounted for both of these things not by recalculating from scratch, but by understanding the direction of the change and extrapolating where the variables would be at the moment of impact rather than the moment of firing. Reading ahead, she fired 4 seconds, 5, The impact sound came back across 3,000 meters, carrying more distance in its delay, more uncertainty in the time it took to arrive. Hit, Archer said. Behind her at the edge of the cleared range, she heard a sound she recognized, the involuntary collective reaction of people who have been holding their breath and have just released it. She did not turn around, but she heard it. And then Archer said, 4,000 meters. Everything on the range became very still. Not the artificial stillness of procedure, the real stillness, the kind that happens when something is about to occur and every person present understands at some level below the analytical that they are witnessing a specific moment that will be the way they remember this day. Elena lay in position. She had been thinking about this distance since the previous morning. She had been cataloging variables since her 6 o'clock walkthrough. She had the inversion layer. She had the wind cycle. She had spent the entire live fire session across every shot, also observing the range flags and the distance scrub and the behavior of the dust at varying distances, and she had the cycle mapped in her mind with the precision of someone who had been watching it build for 2 hours. She had everything she needed, except the window. She waited. 1 minute passed. Archer was still. The team was still. Behind them at the edge of the range, Reyes and the 3 soldiers were still. The desert was not still. The desert was doing what it always did, moving, shifting, cycling through its own rhythms with a complete indifference to human attention that Elena had always found more honest than most things she encountered in the human world. She watched the flags. She watched the distant scrub. She felt the wind on the back of her hand, which she had positioned deliberately where she could feel it, without breaking her hold on the rifle. The second minute passed. She heard someone behind her shift weight. She heard the particular sound of a person fighting the impulse to speak. She waited. And then the window began to open, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to anyone who hadn't spent 2 hours learning the specific cycle of this particular morning. But the flags at mid-range and the flags at range's end aligned briefly in a configuration that matched the pattern she had been tracking, and the wind on the back of her hand carried the specific quality of a system that was for a moment consolidating rather than shifting. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle moved. The sound went out across the desert like something that had been waiting to be released. Elena did not move. She stayed behind the scope because moving was what people did when they were finished, and she was not finished until she knew. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At 4,000 meters, the travel time was long enough to make every second feel like a decision being made somewhere out of sight by something that didn't care about outcome. 7 seconds. The impact sound arrived. Sharp, clean, metal meeting metal at a distance that barely seemed possible. And then Archer's voice, professional, controlled the voice of a man who had spent 22 years assessing precision shooters and had heard this word hundreds of times, said it with a quality that Elena had not heard in his voice before. Hit, he said, and then he said something else quietly that was not part of the standard assessment protocol. He said it in the manner of a person speaking to themselves rather than to the record, but the range was very quiet and everyone heard it. That's the cleanest 4,000-meter shot I've ever evaluated, he said, in 22 years. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Reyes made a sound. Not a word, not a shout. Something more involuntary than either a sharp single sound the kind of person makes when emotion moves faster than they can manage it. And he was a young soldier with composure and training, and he still couldn't stop it from coming out. One of the other soldiers grabbed his shoulder. Elena heard it all. She lay still. She took one breath. Then she stood and she turned and she looked at Colonel Archer. He was looking at her. For the first time since the assessment had begun, the professional assessment face had changed. Not into something unprofessional, into something genuine. The face of a person who has just encountered something that moved the boundary of what they considered possible, and who is being honest about that. Miss Cross, he said. Colonel, she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then where would you like to go from here? It was the same question Whitfield had asked. What do you want? Where do you want to go? The question that a week ago she hadn't had the language for. She looked at the distant ridge. She thought about Harold. She thought about all the mornings on the ranch, all the cold and all the heat and all the patience. That was a skill and not a virtue. All the time spent learning to read ahead rather than read the moment. She thought about Reyes in his notebook and the pressure convergence model that he had worked out on his own in a single night. She thought about Whitfield asking what she wanted and about the fact that what she actually wanted had been true for 30 years, and she had simply never been asked to say it aloud. She turned back to Archer. "I want to teach it," she said. I looked at her. "What I know," she said, "the way my grandfather taught me, not the textbook version, the real version, the version that accounts for the variables that don't appear on the data card, the version that takes years to build and cannot be shortcut and doesn't care who you are or what you've been told about yourself." She held his gaze. "I want to teach people to read ahead." Archer was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have the authority to recommend a formal instructor classification within the civilian contractor structure. It would require 6 weeks of program design and a curriculum review." "When does the 6 weeks start?" she said. He looked at her. He almost smiled. "I'll make the call this afternoon," he said. She nodded. She turned. At the edge of the range, Reyes was looking at her with the expression she had learned to recognize in 2 weeks of early mornings, the expression of someone for whom the possibility of a thing has just become real. She looked at him. "Bay 11, she said. "Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. He nodded once, sharp, certain. "Bring the notebook," she said. She picked up her bucket. She walked to Bay 11, and she began working, and the desert settled around her in the ordinary, honest way that it always had, and the only difference was that this time she was not invisible inside it. This time, everyone on the range knew exactly where she was. The 6 weeks that followed moved the way significant things move faster than expected on the outside, slower and heavier on the inside, where the real work was happening. Elena began the curriculum design the same way she began every morning at Bay 11 before anyone else arrived in the quiet that belonged to her. But now the notebook she carried was not a maintenance log. It was something she had started building the night after Archer made his call, a document that had no official name yet, but that she thought of privately as the translation. The translation of everything Harold Cross had taught her from the language of instinct and accumulated years into the language of transferable knowledge. The language of something that could be given. It was harder than she had expected. Not technically. The technical content she knew completely. She had known it so long and so thoroughly that it lived below the level of language, in her closer to the body than the mind, and pulling it up into words required a kind of excavation that was sometimes exhausting. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was deciding what to keep. Some things could not be translated. Some things Harold had given her were inseparable from the specific mornings they had happened in, from the exact quality of light in the particular way the wind had moved on a day 20 years ago. And if you removed them from that context, they became facts rather than understanding, and facts without understanding were the things she most wanted her students to move beyond. She wrote and crossed out and rewrote. She walked the range at 6 in the morning, talking quietly to herself sometimes, working through the problem of how you taught a person to feel something that most people had stopped noticing years before they started shooting. Reyes found her doing this one morning and stood nearby for a few minutes without speaking. "You're talking to yourself," he finally said. "I'm thinking," she said, "about the curriculum, about what can and can't be taught," she said. I was quiet for a moment, then, "What's the part that can't be taught?" She stopped walking. She looked at him. "The part that can't be taught," she said, "is the willingness to be wrong. Specifically, the willingness to be wrong about what you already know." She paused. Most people come into precision shooting with a model in their head, a framework they built from manuals and instruction and their own successful shots. And that framework works up to a point. But past a certain distance, the model breaks down because the model was built on conditions that no longer exist at that range. And the hardest thing in this discipline is the moment when your model tells you one thing and the environment is telling you another, and you have to choose to trust the environment. Reyes thought about that. "Because the environment is always right," he said. "Physics is always right," she said. "The environment is just physics you can see." He nodded slowly. He opened his notebook and wrote that down. She watched him write it and felt something that she recognized after a moment as the specific warmth of having said something that would live beyond the moment it was spoken. The warmth of transmission, of something passing from one person to another and continuing. She thought about Harold. She wondered if he had felt this. She thought he probably had. The first formal session of Elena's curriculum happened on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the assessment, and it happened in front of an audience she had not anticipated. Archer had told her the class would consist of 8 soldiers, a mixed group of junior and mid-level personnel that the facility had selected based on demonstrated aptitude in early-stage precision training. She had designed the curriculum around 8. She had thought about 8 individuals, their likely learning patterns, the kinds of questions they would ask, the specific habits she would need to address. She arrived at the range at 7:50 to set up, and she found 23 people waiting. Not 8, 23. She stopped. She looked at the group. Some she recognized Rhea's in the first position notebook already in hand. 3 soldiers she had seen on the qualification range. 2 from Caldwell's original demonstration group, the ones who had stood at the back and watched with the careful attention of people who understood they were seeing something real. And Caldwell himself, standing at the far right edge of the group, not in the front, not in a position of prominence, just standing there like any other student. Elena looked at him. He met her eyes. He gave her a single nod that was not deferential and not challenging. It was the nod of a person who has decided to be present and is asking nothing in return for that. She looked at Archer, who was standing off to the side with the expression of someone who has anticipated a reaction and is waiting to see which direction it goes. 23, she said to him. The class filled faster than expected, he said. Word traveled. I designed for 8. The curriculum works for 23, he said. The principles don't change based on class size. She looked at him. I was right, and they both knew it. She set down her materials, and she turned to the group, and she stood in front of them the way her grandfather had stood in front of her for the first time on the ranch. Not performing authority, not establishing hierarchy, but simply occupying the space of someone who has something real to give and intends to give it. My name is Elena Cross, she said. Some of you know who I am. Some of you know what you've heard about who I am, which is different. What you need to know for the purpose of this class is what I can actually give you. She looked across the group slowly. I can give you the framework my grandfather built over a lifetime of precision shooting and teaching. I can give you the methodology that operates past the range of standard training materials. I can give you the tools to read environmental variables not as static measurements, but as moving patterns. And I can give you the specific kind of patience that this discipline requires. She paused. What I cannot give you is the years you have to put in yourself. Everything I teach you accelerates the process, but the process does not disappear. She paused again. Is that understood? A solid murmur of affirmation from the group. She looked at Caldwell. He said nothing, but he nodded. And she began. The first session lasted 4 hours and covered only one subject, the relationship between observation time and shot quality at extreme range. Not a technique, not a calculation method. The underlying principle why watching longer produced better results. What you were actually seeing when you watched, and how to recognize the moment when you had seen enough. It was the kind of content that had no easy metrics. You could not test it with a qualification score. You could only test it by taking the students to the range and watching what they did with the time before they fired. At the end of the 4 hours, Elena said, tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, Bay 11, anyone who wants to see the principle in a field context before we continue. She did not make it mandatory. The following morning, 19 of the 23 were at Bay 11 at 6 o'clock. She looked at them, standing there in the early gray light, notebooks in hand, thermoses of coffee, the focused expressions of people who had decided to take something seriously. She felt Harold in that moment more than she had felt him in years. Not grief, not the hollow ache of loss which she had carried for so long it had become part of the background of her. Something different, something that moved in the opposite direction from loss. Continuation. She picked up her bucket. Watch the flags, she said. Don't talk, just watch. They watched. The twist that nobody saw coming happened on a morning 5 weeks into the curriculum, and it came from a direction Elena had not been tracking. She was at the equipment shed at 11:30 reviewing session notes from that morning's range work when Reyes appeared in the doorway with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the focused intensity, not the careful attention, something more agitated, more uncertain. There's something you need to know, he said. She set down the notes. What? He came inside and closed the door behind him, which was the first signal that this was not a casual conversation. I got a call this morning, he said, from a friend at the Regional Training Command. He monitors personnel evaluations across facilities. He paused. He told me that your assessment results, the full results, including Archer's notes and Cole's written evaluation, have been reviewed at the regional level. I knew they would be, she said. There's a formal recommendation attached to the review, Reyes said. It came from someone above Archer's level, above Whitfield's level. He looked at her directly. The recommendation is to transfer your curriculum to the Regional Training Command. Elena was still. Transfer it, she said. Not transfer you, he said quickly. Transfer the curriculum. They want to replicate the program at 3 other facilities. They want to take what you've built and institutionalize it. He paused. Which means it stops being yours, officially. It becomes property of the regional command, and they assign certified instructors to deliver it, and you go back to. He stopped himself. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and in his face was the same expression she had seen the first morning he came to Bay 11, the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion he doesn't like and is trying to decide whether saying it will make it more real. You go back to what, she said. The recommendation doesn't include your role going forward, he said quietly. Your assessment qualifies you for a civilian instructor classification. But the regional command has its own instructor pool. If the curriculum moves to the regional level, this facility's program ends, and your classification applies to a program that no longer exists here. Elena sat with that. The shed was quiet. Outside the range was active. She could hear the distant percussion of the qualification line, the particular rhythm of a facility in full operation. She thought about what it would mean. She thought about the sessions at 6 o'clock, about Reyes and his notebook, about the 19 soldiers standing at Bay 11 in the gray morning, watching the flags in silence, about the moment 3 weeks ago when one of them, a young corporal named Marsh, had made a hit at 2,800 meters on his first attempt at that distance and had stood up from the ground, shaking slightly, not from nerves, but from the physical release of having done something he had not been certain he could do. She thought about her grandfather, about what he had built on that ranch outside Flagstaff, on a private range that no institution had ever owned. She thought about what it meant when something true became the property of a system. When is the decision final? She asked. Friday, Reyes said. They're presenting it to Whitfield Friday morning. She has final sign-off on whether the facility cooperates with the transfer. Today was Tuesday. Elena looked at the session notes in front of her. All right, she said. All right, he said. I heard you, she said. I said all right. He stared at her. What are you going to do? She picked up the notes. I'm going to finish the session review, she said. And then I'm going to go speak to Whitfield. She was in Whitfield's office at 2:15. Whitfield was behind the desk, and Elena noticed immediately that she was not reading a document, not reviewing a report, not in the middle of anything that required interruption. She was sitting with both hands on the desk and the look of someone who had been expecting a visitor. You know, Elena said. Archer told me this morning, Whitfield said. Elena sat down. She did not wait to be invited this time. She sat with the directness of someone who had been thinking hard for 2 hours and had arrived somewhere specific. What's your position? Elena asked. Whitfield looked at her steadily. My position, she said, is that this facility has produced something genuinely valuable in the past 6 weeks. I have evaluation data from 23 students, and 11 of them have shown measurable improvement at distances above 2,000 meters that exceeds our standard program's 6-month outcome benchmarks. In 6 weeks. She paused. That data belongs to this facility, and the methodology that produced it belongs in the most important sense to you. But Elena said, because there was a but. But the regional command does not need my agreement to make a recommendation, Whitfield said. They need my signature on a cooperation agreement, which I have not signed. Elena was quiet for a moment. Will you? She asked. Whitfield held her gaze. That depends on what you want, she said. For the 4th time in 6 weeks, I am asking you what you want. And this time I need the answer to be very specific because I cannot protect something I don't have clear instructions to protect. Elena thought about what she wanted. She thought about it, not in the abstract, not in the grand sense of purpose and legacy and what Harold would have wanted. She thought about it practically specifically with the same methodology she used at the firing line. What is actually here? What is actually moving? What is the window? I want 2 things, she said. I want the curriculum to expand. I don't object to other facilities using it. The knowledge should travel. She paused. But I want the source to travel with it. I want the instructor to be someone who learned from the source, not someone the regional command assigned from their existing pool because it's convenient. She paused again. And I want this to be named for my grandfather, Harold Cross, not as a vanity, as an attribution. He built this. I translated it. If it's going to become an institutional program, then the institution should know where it came from. Whitfield was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Elena began to understand the weight of what she had said. Long enough that she started to wonder if she had asked for too much. Then Whitfield said, "The Harold Cross Precision Curriculum." Elena looked at her. "That's what it would be called," Whitfield said. "If I write the counter proposal to the regional command, if I recommend expansion through instructor certification rather than curriculum transfer, if I propose that the program remain source-connected, meaning this instructor pool consists of graduates of this program trained under your direct supervision, carrying the methodology forward in the way it was built to be carried." She paused. "That's the proposal, if you agree to it." Elena did not speak immediately. She sat in Commander Whitfield's office with the desert sun coming through the window and the distant sound of the range outside, and she thought about a man she had loved more than anyone she had ever known, who had spent 30 years shooting at targets in the desert with nobody watching, who had told her once that the only biography that mattered was what you spent your time on, who had taught a girl that patience was not a virtue but a skill, who had never not once asked for recognition, and she thought he deserves to be named. He deserves to exist in the language of this place. She thought about what it would mean for people she would never meet to read the words Harold Cross on a curriculum document and wonder who he was and maybe ask someone and maybe hear the answer. Her voice, when she found it, was steady. "Write the proposal," she said. Whitfield reached for her pen. Caldwell came to find her that evening. Not in the morning, not at Bay 11, not in the structured context of the sessions. He came at 5:47 as she was finishing her final maintenance check of the day, the moment just before the range went fully quiet and the facility settled into the particular solitude of after hours. I was not in uniform. He was in civilian clothes, which on Caldwell looked like a kind of disclosure, the removal of the rank and the record and the institutional identity, leaving just a man in his early 40s who looked without those things slightly less certain of where to stand. "I heard about the regional command recommendation," he said. "News still travels fast," she said. "Always will," he said. "It's a small facility." He paused. "I also heard what you're doing about it." She looked at him. "Whitfield's assistant talks to people," he said without apology for knowing. "Then the Harold Cross curriculum." She said nothing. "I want you to know," he said, and he said it with the careful steadiness of someone who has been thinking about how to say something for a while, "that when I teach, when I'm up there and I'm talking to junior soldiers about what precision shooting is, about what it actually requires, I used to talk about myself, my record, my experience." He stopped. He looked at the ground briefly and then back at her. "I'm going to talk about your grandfather now, about what he built, about the fact that the best demonstration of this discipline I have ever personally witnessed was produced not by 11 years of institutional training, but by a man who spent 30 years on a private ranch teaching his granddaughter to read the wind." He paused. "I want you to know that." Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning 6 weeks ago, when he had pointed at the distant ridge and offered a challenge. He expected her to fail. She thought about the metal sound of the bullet arriving at 4,000 meters and the word he had said and the quietness with which he had said it. She thought about how much a person could change in 6 weeks when they decided to. And she thought about how much they couldn't. "Ryan," she said. He looked slightly surprised. She had not used his first name before. "You're a good teacher," she said. "You've always been. That was never the problem." He absorbed that. "What was the problem?" "You forgot that the best teachers are also students," she said. "You stopped being a student somewhere along the way, and that's when the teaching got hollow." She paused. "You're a student again now. I can see it when you're in the sessions." I was quiet. "Is that what you're going to tell the junior soldiers?" she asked. "About my grandfather?" "Yes," he said. "Then tell them that too," she said, "that the teacher has to keep being a student, that the moment you stop learning is the moment you start costing your students something they should be getting." He nodded, not sharp and certain the way Reyes nodded, slower, the nod of someone taking on weight rather than releasing it. He started to turn. "Caldwell," she said. He stopped. "Come to Bay 11 tomorrow," she said. 6 o'clock. He turned back and looked at her. "You're including me in the morning sessions," he said. "I'm including everyone who wants to keep learning," she said. "Rank doesn't change the entry point. The entry point is 6 o'clock and a willingness to be corrected." He stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been given something they didn't know they needed until the moment it was offered. "I'll be there," he said. He walked away. She watched him go, and then she turned back to her work and finished the last maintenance check of the day, and by 6 o'clock the range was quiet, and she was the only person left on it. She stood at the end of the firing line for a while. She looked at the distant ridge. 4,000 meters. The steel plate was still there, fixed to the base of the far ridge the same way it had been fixed there on the morning that started all of this. It was not remarkable to look at from this distance, a small shape at the edge of what the eye could resolve. She thought about the bullet, about the moment it left the rifle and traveled out across the desert, across 4,000 meters of heat and wind, and all the complex invisible forces that worked on it, constantly trying to move it from its path. About the way it resisted those forces, not by fighting them, but by being already ahead of them, by having been aimed not at where the target was, but at where the understanding of the pattern said it would be. Read ahead. She thought about Harold. She thought about him at 74 on that last morning, lying behind his rifle with hands that weren't quite steady, completely still. The stillness that was not physical, the stillness that lived below the body in the part of a person that knows what it is and does not need to perform that knowledge for anyone. She thought about what it meant to carry something for 30 years in silence, and then to translate it into words, and then to give it away piece by piece, morning by morning, to 19 people at Bay 11 and 23 people on the firing line, and one young specialist who showed up before sunrise with a notebook and the right kind of attention. She thought about what Harold would say if he could see this. She thought he would say something like good, not with emotion, not with the weight of accumulated pride or the relief of recognition finally arrived. Just a simple word. Just good. The way he said it when a shot was clean and the physics had been understood and there was nothing more to add. She picked up the bucket. It was empty. The range was clean. The day's work done, everything in its place. She held it at her side. And she stood there one more moment in the quiet of Silverhawk training range at the end of the firing line with the distant target she could barely see, and the last light of the afternoon on her face, and she breathed. One breath. Then she turned and walked toward the equipment shed, and her footsteps were the same footsteps she had made every evening for 3 years, and the bucket swung at her side the same way it had always swung, and she moved through the facility with the same quiet efficiency that had made her invisible for so long. But the range knew her name now. Every bay she had walked, every length of line she had cleared, every early morning she had spent in the dark before anyone arrived. All of it had accumulated into something that was visible now, permanent, woven into the fabric of this place in a way that could not be undone. The Harold Cross Precision Curriculum would be signed into official existence the following Friday. The proposal, when Whitfield sent it to the regional command, was accompanied by 11 student evaluation reports that demonstrated outcome data the regional command's existing programs had not produced in 5 years. The counter-proposal was accepted without significant revision. The program remained source-connected. The instructor pool would consist of certified graduates. The name on the document would be Harold Cross. Reyes would become the first certified graduate and the first external instructor assigned to a sister facility in Nevada 18 months later, where he would begin teaching layered wind calculation to a new group of students and would tell them on the first morning about a woman who had taught him that the secret to extreme long-range shooting was not the calculation, but the direction, not the measurement, but the movement, not where things were, but where they were going. Caldwell would submit a request for formal enrollment in the curriculum 3 days after his conversation with Elena at the equipment shed. It would be approved. He would be, by a significant margin, the most technically experienced student in the program, and he would also be, by Elena's private assessment, the most genuinely changed by it. He would graduate 18 months later with the highest evaluation score in the program's first cohort, not because he was the most gifted student, but because he was the one who had arrived with the most to unlearn and had unlearned it fully. He would say at his graduation in front of the cohort, and Commander Whitfield and Colonel Archer, the best shot I ever made wasn't at a target. It was the day I decided to stop performing what I knew and start learning what I didn't. And Diana Peralta would write a second article 1 year after the first, not about the 4,000-meter shot, but about the program, about the students, about what it looked like when a skill built in private over 30 years became something that traveled. She would describe walking through Silver Hawk training range at 6 in the morning and finding 19 people standing at Bay 11 in the pre-dawn quiet, watching range flags without speaking, learning to read the direction of things before the things had moved. She would call it, in her article, the longest shot of all. And Elena Cross would read the article in her apartment, 6 miles from the facility on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and she would sit with it for a long time, and then she would set the phone down and look at the far wall where she had hung, after Harold died, the single photograph she had of him, not behind the rifle, not on the range, but sitting on the front steps of the ranch, in the early morning with a cup of coffee in his hands, and the desert spread out behind him, and an expression on his face of pure, uncomplicated peace. She looked at the photograph. She said, "We got there, Harold." The photograph didn't answer. But the desert always had its own kind of language, and she had spent 30 years learning to read it, and what it told her in that moment was simple and complete and required no further translation. The shot had always been true. It just needed time to arrive.